Hello and welcome to the Empowered Couples Podcast, where here you get modern, non-boring relationship advice for you and your partner to communicate like pros, fight smarter, and stay on the same team no matter the challenge that you face. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman.
And I'm Jocelyn Freeman, but you all just know us as the Freemans.
And this episode is about forgiveness and letting go of the past.
And I know that as you read and hear the word forgiveness, it might already start to bring things up. And so because this is such a big topic, we're going to break it down into the following sections. So we're going to talk about what forgiveness is and what it's not, examples of where forgiveness may be needed in a marriage, what blocks the ability to forgive, and then practical steps to forgive in your marriage pertaining to specific scenarios that we'll break down.
Yeah, and forgiveness has a lot to do with all of your relationships, whether friends or family. And so most of this will apply to those as well. But obviously, this is the Empowered Couples Podcast. And we are specifically talking about forgiveness between the two of you as romantic partners and or spouses. And forgiveness is really just a crucial element in general of living a life free from, this might sound strong, bondage and the offenses that happen in your own individual past. Now, even in terms of your marriage, it's an interesting thing to really think about. I'll say this, and you may say something different. I personally have not met a lot of couples in which one partner was specifically intent or malicious on an offense.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
I think that's definitely for the couples that we work with. Yeah, that it's not an intentional act.
Now, does that mean that there isn't anything to forgive? No, like most couples that come across our path or we talk to or we do events with or email us or we coach with, there's plenty that needs to be forgiven, and really our process is about repair. And so that's interesting to think about, because if it's not being intentional, then you think, well, I got to be free from the offenses of my past, which again are often sort of by mistake or by unintention, unconscious action, patterns that happen within the relationship. You could say where there have been conflict cycles that have been repeating in your marriage, or strong emotional reactions to events.
Promises not kept, big or small.
Yeah, and I think largely a lot of that then forms certain negative views or perceptions of your partner. And so you want to be free from that, right? If just from an individual perspective, you want to be free from those repeating patterns, those mistakes. Otherwise, you just sort of are doomed to repeat them in the future. And so that's kind of the context for why forgiveness is really important. And without having that forgiveness, like if you're holding on to some of these things from the past, we know from psychology that it actually decreases your marriage satisfaction. I mean, you haven't come across, nor have we come across, a couple that would say, yeah, there's a lot that we haven't forgiven or repaired, and our marriage satisfaction is really high.
Yeah.
Right? These are two opposing things. So having a lack of forgiveness, it decreases your marital satisfaction, and it does that with primarily these two terms that we brought up in the last few weeks. It reduces your feeling of emotional closeness and reduces your desire for proximity, or if you want to simplify it, just wanting to be around your partner. Yeah. So lack of forgiveness lowers the satisfaction, and it does that because you don't feel as close and you don't want to be as present and in the same physical proximity as your partner.
I also think what you said about that word bondage, it really does keep you too tethered to the past, whether that's the recent past or the distant past. It's like, how can you two really create a compelling future, something that inspires you, a new version of a relationship that you want to strengthen as a couple if you are still tethered to the past? So I think you get the importance of this. Let's go into the section, what is and what is not forgiveness. And before Aaron defines it more clearly, I just want to say that forgiveness in most cases is not like this instantaneous singular moment. It's very often a process over time, and that time will depend on the significance or severity of the thing needing forgiveness, right? So that process could take a couple days of conversations and the steps that we're going to outline. It can take weeks, years for bigger things, which again, we'll give examples of that. But I want you to use that word in your mind, like that it is this process. And therefore, it's not fair for us to just tell our partner, you should just forgive me, especially if, as we outline the steps, you haven't done two of the steps, for example, right? Like we haven't actually fulfilled on the process. We didn't have a process for forgiveness. I can't demand forgiveness from my partner if there's ingredients missing. So I was thinking about this and I was like, forgiveness in our relationship. It may take less time and less steps if Aaron, for example, said harsh things in an argument, but it wasn't a pattern, and he not only followed our repair steps from our making up and moving forward guide on repair from conflict, and he never did it again. Okay, that's a little bit easier to repair. It might just take one conversation to repair that and resolve it and forgive. However, if it was something more significant, like he had for a period of time, let's say a year, been lying to me about credit card debt that he built up. It was purchases I didn't even know. And then suddenly I find out we have X amount of money of debt that he never told me about. And suddenly it comes to my awareness and I had to find it. That's going to take a longer process and more conversations. So I just want to put that it's really relative. And so that's why like you can't have a specific timeline in your mind of like, you should be able to forgive me in a day. You should be able to forgive me in a week, because it is relative.
And I think oftentimes the forgiveness is, well, it's hard to reach. It's hard to act out sometimes because I think largely it has been conceptual. So whether it is a term being defined theologically or theoretically, I think that's one of the barriers to actually having forgiveness. So we found some various places that have a psychology definition of this. So let me start here. This will be brief and then we'll move into, really what it looks like more practically. I think one of the big barriers, which we'll say more about too, is that forgiveness is not an excuse. It's not condoning, and it's not just strictly forgetting the event or the behavior or the offense that happened. Mm-hmm. Now, pulling from some various definitions then in psychology, it is one of the things, and this is not sequential order, it is an opportunity for you to release any anger or guilt, which is the result of maybe some unconscious anger you have about a situation or various situations that have happened between you and your partner in the past. Mm-hmm. You could also look at forgiveness as overcoming the judgments that you have that keeps you from accepting your partner or the offender by still showing compassion, kindness, and love, again, without denying that there was an impact. That really speaks to, this isn't just a letting go or just forgetting. And it's also a decrease in the desire to take revenge or retaliate against your partner. And there's also a decrease in the desire to stay away from your partner, while at the same time, you'll feel an increase in goodwill and the desire to make peace with your partner, again, despite the harmful actions that may have occurred.
Can I offer some of the ways I would define it?
Yeah.
So the way I think of it in my mind is that, number one, forgiveness is a conscious choice. Like there becomes a moment where we choose to free ourselves and free our partner from said thing. And it's like a coming to terms with something. And that's why there's often a series of conversations needed in order to come to terms. And we're going to outline that because this is often what is missing. But it's like, okay, I've come to terms with what happened, what it meant, how it impacted me, how it impacted our relationship. And I am choosing to forgive because we have all the ingredients in place. and to free myself and free my partner from that bondage.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, there's like that conscious choice moment in there that we want to free ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. And one common thread here for situations that would require forgiveness, there must be what's called a wound situation or a place that there was a rupture. Mm-hmm. Now, we do want to acknowledge that there are levels of severity of this kind of wound situation or ruptures. And so we want to just quickly talk about some of them. One being one of the more obvious ones or ones you would think more of around forgiveness. So we'll just start with maybe more of the severe levels. But infidelity, whether that's physical or emotional, you can go to breaches of trust around finances or maybe looking at explicit materials, then maybe inappropriate remarks about, say, the attractiveness of another person. You can have harsh reactions or accusations or personal attacks and labels in times of conflict. Maybe even putting a child in harm's way or other general hurtful comments about one's character. Mm-hmm. Now, these could all be potential wound situations. And so we want to just give you kind of a list that it's clear that there can be levels of severity. Now, for the forgiveness, as we go into what blocks it or the steps, you can't really judge necessarily an event, a wound situation that a partner feels. Like you couldn't come to me and say, oh man, here's a place I need some forgiveness or I need some repair. And then you share it with me and I say, oh, that doesn't fit. That's not a wound situation.
That's true.
That's not going to go very well. So it's kind of an acknowledgement that these wound situations do have different levels of severity. And I think there's a level of just acknowledging when your partner identifies when there is one for them.
You bring up a good point about the severity. I also think that even things that are seemingly small, but they are continuous over a long period of time can also increase the severity as well, right? Mm-hmm. So let's go into now what blocks the ability to forgive, and then we're going to go into the steps to have these forgiveness opportunities as a couple.
If I may, I want to start with this one because this is one I can personally just relate to. If I think of times where I'm more hesitant to forgive, and I think, for us, because we do this work, most of our places to forgive really just come from certain comments that we might each make in a tension or a conflict or a disagreement. So I'm not sure either one of us would say there's like a wound situation, but I can certainly see where I hold myself back from either initiating repair or apologizing or even just kind of letting go and forgiving even myself for that situation. And
can I really quick share, actually, I just think this is important for couples to hear. There was a powerful moment last year before we really moved into this new home and everything, where maybe you even just like forgot this memory, but we had to sit down and have a forgiveness conversation about the mistakes that we both made financially. Because for those of you who are newer here, we went through an extremely challenging year in 2022 from some bad financial choices that we both made. We each had picked like different investments that both did not do well, both failed. And it was a very, very hard year. But you and I, we sat down and we talked about it and the steps that we're going to go into. And we, in that moment, said to each other, I forgive you. And not only that, but we forgave ourselves too. Like it was a moment of, I need to forgive myself from this decision that impacted us and our family, and I'm going to forgive you. So that was a bigger moment that we had to have a forgiveness conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Were they bad choices or were they just investments that put us at risk?
Okay, you're right. Yeah. So we didn't know in the moment they were a bad choice. They ended up having poor outcomes for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't like I gambled hundreds of thousands of dollars at the local casino or something like that.
True. That's a good point.
So, yeah, but I do resonate and agree with what you're saying. We did have to sit down and do that ourselves. And this is not one of those examples, but again, even more simply, I can see where we get into a tension, even last couple of weeks, what is the block for me around just forgiving? And I can see for myself that it's that if I forgive, even if it's a comment you made to me, right? And I'm still in the emotion of it, that by me forgiving, I condone I'm using you as an example, obviously. I condone you and the actions that you took.
Mm-hmm.
That's really the biggest part for me. And then with that, it's like, well, I condone, I let you off the hook from that action, even though I was impacted. And then I think the next layer is that, well, then I must be subjecting myself to this happening again in the future.
Mm-hmm. I completely get that. Absolutely. The next thing that can block the ability to forgive is that it's difficult to grant that forgiveness if the other person hasn't even acknowledged the offense. Again, that can be arranged on a spectrum there. They haven't even acknowledged it or taken responsibility for it. Maybe they've been deflecting about it. They've been denying, making excuses. This shouldn't be a big deal. You should be able to forgive me. Oh, even using things like in marriage, you're supposed to forgive people, right? And so there's missing that responsibility and that true acknowledgement. Next to that would be really deeply acknowledging the impact. Like, I need to be able to say, I really see how this rattled your ability to trust me. And I get that. Like almost a moment of putting yourself in their shoes. And that is definitely a block. Like if I can't put myself in your shoes and be like, yeah, I can see how this would make you struggle to feel like you can trust what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Or I understand I actually made promises to you and I didn't consistently follow through. And I understand that makes my character questionable to you, right? So in a sense, I haven't said this term in a long time, but like a falling on the sword, that I can in a sense surrender to, wow, yeah, like whatever I did had an impact on you.
Mm-hmm. This is the complex one because oftentimes you can feel as if you talk through a situation, there was repair, there was forgiveness, and you move on, and then your partner brings it back up later. Then there's a trigger that, why are you bringing this back up? We already talked about this. It's already forgiven. Well, that really speaks to this last point that if the change isn't consistent, I acknowledge the offense, I take responsibility, here's how I'm going to be different, and it only goes for like a week or two, and then you do the same thing, then it kind of erases the previous forgiveness.
For sure. So the first step, while it may seem obvious, we have to first outline what is the conversation that we're having, what is the thing that we need repair on. So if I'm not resolved about something, then I need to come to the table and say, hey, I need to have a conversation about blank. I don't feel I'm repaired from it or I'm able to forgive until we talk through some things. So we need to outline like what's the subject, what's the topic. Next, and this is an interesting one and where so many couples get stuck, and it's the need for clarity on details or the motivations behind the action. I'll start with the motivations behind the action because this is a big one. And I know that especially like women who are verbal processors, like we need to, the way I think of it in my mind is like, I need to know that you know why you did said thing. It's like that self-awareness. How am I supposed to just take your word for it of like, I won't do it again, if you don't even know what drives you to get there, or you don't have that self-awareness. Let's even say it's about, how you handle a trigger in conflict. If I don't feel confident that you understand that trigger, where it comes from, you're able to sense when it's coming up, and that you can't in the moment recognize you're triggered, then how can I just trust you when you say, I won't do it again, I won't yell at you again, for example. And so having that deeper understanding of where your actions come from is so, so important to this. The other piece that I had said, the need for clarity on details, that definitely is true if it had been something like, lying about financial charges, or when Erin mentioned the different forms of infidelity, that's when people would really need to have it outlined a lot of times. Like I need to know the who, what, when, where, how of it so that I don't feel like more details are going to come up at a later time. Anything more you'd say on that step, Erin?
Not that step, but I want to talk a little bit about the forgiveness in regards to how it frees you as an individual. And I think this is one of the more difficult parts to actually having forgiveness in our own individual lives. is because you have to have a stronger desire to forgive because it does impact your closeness and your desire to be around your partner. And so the question really becomes, do you want to hold on to anger and have that build into resentment because you feel like you were offended? Because if you do, it's going to impact your closeness and your desire to be around each other. And so you have to make that shift into, you see that impact and you have to, it's a hard shift. You have to actually want closeness and to be around each other more than just holding on to this thing. And it really then frees you from any pain, any suffering, any mental spiral that holding on to these hurts can get you into. And this is really for yourself, combined with that wanting to be close and wanting to be around your partner, right? That's obviously for your own experience and for your partner. So that's really, to me, the transition to make with all the steps and the conversations and the responsibility and the repair. But until you can make this mental and emotional shift, I think it's hard to move on.
What's so important about what you said is that from that place of this is the intention for the conversations, it's going to feel totally different than let me sit here and list out why you're a crappy person. Like the energy of what Aaron just outlined of, yes, I want to forgive. I want to be free of this. I want you to be free of this. I want us both to be free from this. That energy is going to feel different in the conversation than let's just battle this out and talk about all of each other's wrongdoings. So then from that energy and where your heart is at to want to forgive, now the steps, and again, this is all outlined with prompts and fill in the blanks and all the things in our guide that we had referred to, the Steps to Rebuild a Marriage Guide. But you would basically be going through any of the items that need forgiveness. Maybe there's only one thing. Maybe there's 5, medium-sized things that you feel need forgiveness. You would then be talking through each one so that you feel there's an understanding of how it impacted that person. And perhaps with a certain event, both of you might need some of that acknowledgement, right? Like that can definitely be the case, is where you both need to be heard out on how it impacted you, how it impacted your partner, and to feel that sense of understanding, maybe even some empathy if you can get there. That can be a jump for some people, but at least that true acknowledgement. And again, it can't just be shorthanded like, all right, I'm sorry for that, okay? It has to be truly a deeper acknowledgement of, for example, I really understand that by me choosing to invest into that real estate opportunity that we did, and I know that I was the one that was really driving that and wanted to do it, and I know that in a sense I kind of even rushed some of the decision making, and I know you still had questions, but I was like, let's do it anyway. And I understand that how that impacted us financially not only rattled your sense of security, but even like wondering, how we're going to make financial decisions in the future. And I really understand that. And I want you to know I have gotten the lesson. I see where I was trying to make the decision too quickly. And I want to show you like I'm going to be different with financial decisions moving forward. Now, that's a very shorthanded version of it, and fill in the blank with the things that pertain to your situation. But it shows more thought. It shows that I truly am considering that impact, as opposed to, again, just the blanket okay, sorry about it. Can we move on? That's just, that doesn't show a true care and consideration if you have that kind of attitude towards apologies.
And in those moments, it can feel as if there is forgiveness granted. Now, as we mentioned earlier, you still have to make sure that you're committed to the follow through with the new promise, the new agreement, the change that you said you're going to make. Otherwise, if you don't, it's going to then feel as if, well,
you're all talk, no walk.
Why is this coming back up? I thought we had already talked about this and forgiven it. So there is a role here in the overall follow through so that the trust is regained and that forgiveness can truly be granted and that the past is put in the past?
I would say it's a huge percentage of it, right? There's definitely the repair conversations needed. And then the follow through, to me, I couldn't give it like an exact percentage, but it's huge. And I know that you and I, that's one of the biggest reasons that we can count on each other. And I would say trust each other and forgive, the big or the small things, is because we continuously make progress. We don't forget about the promises that we make to each other. We remember, whether we need to write it down or talk about it in our family meeting each week to remember it. And so we show each other that change because we take it seriously, because that's your integrity. That's your word. When you make these promises to your partner of what you're going to change, that's your word. How else can they trust you besides you following through, and not just following through a day and then defaulting to old things and old patterns, but continuously making progress? Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be perfect. Of course, you should be perfect with certain things, right? Like there's certain where there's like no room for error. You don't get a pass. Oops, no, I just made a mistake. There's certain things you don't get any passes on. But let's say it's around like emotional regulation in conflict, right? And so you two have talked about, how it's impacted each other by the ways that you act in conflict, and you make promises. You use even our guides to create agreements for times of conflict. It doesn't mean you're now going to be flawless in how you handle your emotions, but you do need to show measurable change time and time again, right? It needs to be trending in a good direction. And some of them with the promises, it's like you need to delete it from your behaviors altogether. And of course, that takes learning new skills. Like, we're not just saying that by making the promise, you're now equipped to follow through. And we even talk about that in our Steps to Rebuild a Marriage guide. It's even the last step about, okay, what are some of the tools and skills that you're going to need to really master and focus on in order to fulfill on your promises? Let's say it was a financial breach. Okay, you may need to learn some financial skills, read some books about money mindset and money strategy. Or if it's around conflict, you may need to learn about emotional regulation. So I don't want you to think that the only step you need to take is the making of the promise and then you're just going to be able to follow through. You may need to learn some things in order to follow through. So we've covered a lot here. I think we'll kind of end it. Make sure you go back and re-listen because we know that this is a big topic. If you do want additional support, because we already know when we wrote this outline, we know it can feel daunting at times to tackle these conversations because maybe you're afraid of like getting it wrong, triggering each other, getting derailed. That's why we created these steps in our guide and the Rebuilding Us Couples Challenge, because it breaks it down. And we do recommend pairing the two of them. Like, you could sign up for the Rebuilding Us Challenge and then add the guide on, because we designed it to break it down in a way that isn't overwhelming. And you're like, how do we fit this into our busy lives? So we're here for you. Here's what we want. We're nearing the end of the year. We want you to go into this next year free of the past, really coming to terms with everything you need to, and showing each other that it can be better than ever, that you have not just changed, you have transformed. You've become the best versions of yourselves. So we really hope you take this on. We're rooting for you guys, and we will talk to you on the next episode.